2 mana 2/2s are called Grizzly Bears, or just bears by the community, after the famous card of the same name from all the way back in Alpha. This isn't a good stat line, so these cards need to have some really good abilities to see play. So today we're going to go over some of the best creatures with bear stat lines in Magic. Starting us off at number 10, we have Burning Tree Emissary. This is a 2/2 human shaman with a mana cost of 2 red-green hybrid mana, which can be paired with either red or green mana, and it has the ability where whenever Burning Tree Emissary enters the battlefield, you add 1 red and green mana. Burning Tree is a great way to fill boards super quickly, because 1 Burning Tree gives you the mana you need to cast another one, and you can just chain as many of them as you want together. Now, you usually not have more than 2 copies in your hand by turn 2, but when you can pull it off, it's very strong. Not to mention that you can simply cast another 2-drop instead of another Burning Tree instead, and you'd still get a huge tempo swing. Even better, there are some ways to make even more use of your board full of emissaries. There's a card called Nykthos Shrine to Nyx, which is a legendary land that you can tap for 1 colorless mana, or you can pay 2 and tap it to choose a color, and then add mana equal to your devotion to that color. Your devotion to a color is just however many mana symbols of that color are in all the mana costs of the permanents you control, including hybrid mana. So if you have 1 emissary on your board, some lands and nothing else, your devotion to red and green are both equal to 2. So if you happen to draw all 4 of your emissaries in another 2-drop, you can add 9 mana or more on turn 3. Now, this was a synergy that people played Burning Tree with, but you don't need to be doing something like this for the card to be good. A free 2/2 is just really great for aggro decks, which is why the card not only saw a ton of play in formats like Pioneer and Historic, but it was actually briefly banned at Historic due to being too powerful. Though it has been let off the ban list since then. Burning Tree doesn't see play in any older formats, as a 2/2 just isn't impactful enough in formats like Modern or Legacy. Still, the card's dominance in formats like Pioneer is enough to get on this list. And at number 9, we have Duskwatch Recruiter. This is a 2/2 human warrior werewolf with a mana cost of 1 and 1 green. It has the abilities where you can pay 2 and 1 green to look at the top 3 cards of your library. You can reveal a creature card you find there and put it into your hand, and then put the others on the bottom of your library. It also has the ability where at the beginning of each upkeep, if no spells were cast last turn, you transform it into a Crawling Horde Howler. This is a 3/3 werewolf with the abilities where creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, and at the beginning of each upkeep, if 2 or more spells were cast last turn, you transform it back into Duskwatch. This is an ability shared by basically all of the Innistrad werewolves, and it's a bit finicky and hard to use. Usually, these cards only see play if their front half is really good, and luckily, Duskwatch is very good. Being able to pay 3 mana to draw a creature card if you really need one is great, especially if you're a deck that's built around getting certain creatures into play. In Modern, there was a very strong deck called Devoted Druid combo. The Druid itself is a 0/2 for 1 and 1 green that you could tap for 1 green, and you could put a -1/-1 counter on the Druid to untap it. The combo came in when you used the card called Vizier of Remedies, which made it so that if a creature you controlled would have a -1/-1 counter on it, instead you put 1 less -1/-1 counter on it. In the case of the Druid's untap ability, it would replace putting on its -1 counters and instead put 0 -1 counters on it. This means that you could just do this over and over to make infinite green mana. Then the deck would cast a huge walking ballista with 100 or so counters on it and simply burn your opponent down with its ability to ping any target any number of times. Duskwatch was great in this deck, not only as a way to find your Druid and Vizier, but after you found those pieces, you might be missing the ballista to win the game. In that case, you could just use your Duskwatch as many times as you needed to find your ballista, and then continue the combo from there. Now, this was really strong, but Devoted Druid combo decks have been usurped by Yawgmoth combo decks as the best creature-based combo in Modern, and Yawgmoth decks don't have as much use for Duskwatch. It still sees play in Devoted Druid combo decks and in the odd creature-based deck in the format, but if you can't make infinite mana, Duskwatch's ability is a lot less enticing. It's still nice to have around, but you'd usually just want to play a different creature, so Duskwatch takes a bit of a low spot on this list. And at number 8, we have Charming Prince. This is a 2/2 human noble with a mana cost of 1 and 1 white with the ability where, whenever it enters the battlefield, you choose one. Scry 2, meaning you look at the top 2 cards of your deck and put them either on top or bottom however you want. You can gain 3 life, or you can exile another target creature you own and return to the battlefield under your control at the beginning of the next end step. Prince is obviously a very versatile card, but the most powerful mode is exiling one of your creatures and return it to the battlefield. You see, Magic has a ton of creatures, like the Prince himself, with enter the battlefield triggers that Prince can get you an additional copy of. For example, Baleful Strix lets you draw a card when it enters the battlefield. Extraction Specialist lets you return a creature card with a mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, but it can't attack or block for as long as you control the specialist. Extraction Specialist in particular is really strong, because it can actually bring back your Charming Prince. This means you can do things like play Specialist to bring back Prince, use Prince to flicker your Specialist, then at the end of the turn use Specialist to bring back something else, like Baleful Strix. And these are some of the pretty modest uses of the card. Now, we should mention Prince's other modes, even though they're far less useful. Scrying 2 will let you find more action when you need it, and gaining life is always nice to help against aggro decks, or just give you another turn in a tight spot. While Charming Prince is good, it does have the issue that there are other cards that do its job too. Most famously, Flickerwiz. Still, Prince does have his niche, and has seen play in formats like Modern Legacy and creature-based strategies that can make use of him. And at number 7, we have Unsettled Mariner. This is a 2/2 shapeshifter with a mana cost of 1 white and 1 blue. It has Changeling, meaning that it always has all creature types, and it has the ability where whenever you or a permanent you control becomes a target of a spell or ability, you counter that spell or ability unless its controller pays 1. Mariner is a great card for any deck that wants to put a lot of important threats onto the board. This type of blanket protection can really stop your opponent from enacting their game plan. 1 mana may not seem like a lot, but 1 mana is the difference between Lightning Bolt and Lightning Strike. Lightning Bolt is thought of as one of the best red cards in Magic, while Strike is barely thought of at all. Turning all of your opponent's bolts into strikes is great for just 2 mana. As great as this protection is, it doesn't change the Mariner's mediocre stats. Mariner on its own doesn't really do all that much, which is why it's played with other, more impactful cards that put out a lot of damage. Your opponent's going to have a hard time figuring out whether they should kill your giant creature, or your Mariner that's making all their other removal spells worse. So Mariner is usually playing things like tribal aggro decks to make your board really hard to get rid of, while the other cards in your deck do the whole winning the game thing. It being an honorary member of every tribe helps a lot too, as it can often get pretty big thanks to all of your tribal lords. Unfortunately for Mariner, cards like Fury have really made these strategies bad in the format, and these decks haven't been good in Legacy or Vintage for years. Still, whenever people do play these decks, they usually play Mariner, especially because it happens to be really good against Fury. And at number 6, we have Sanctifier En-vec. This is a 2/2 human cleric with a mana cost of 2 white. It has protection from black and red, meaning it can't be damaged, targeted, blocked, or enchanted by anything that's black or red. It also has the abilities where, whenever it enters the battlefield, you exile all black and red cards from all graveyards. And whenever a black or red permanent, spell, or card would be put into a graveyard, you exile it instead. This is a pretty great piece of sideboard tech for graveyard decks. As it turns out, a lot of the problematic cards that you don't want in your opponent's graveyard just so happen to be either black or red, like Conflagrate or Prize Amalgam. On top of that, having protection from 2 colors makes this card hard to remove, as black and red are colors that are usually known for being good at removing creatures. There are other cards that can do something similar, like Rest in Peace, but Sanctifier has the upside of also being a creature that can either protect you or start trying to kill your opponent, which it's pretty good at least against certain decks. If all your opponent's cards are black or red, then this card will be a huge headache. This unique combination of abilities makes Sanctifier a great option for decks that both need graveyard hate, but don't want to go into a long game and appreciate the additional pressure Sanctifier provides. Aggro decks would much rather play a creature that shuts down their opponent, and might be a little worse in some matchups, than have to give up a turn playing Rest in Peace and not developing their board. And at number 5, we have Meddling Mage. This is a 2/2 human wizard with a mana cost of 1 white and 1 blue. It has the abilities where, as it enters the battlefield, you choose a non-land card name, and players can't cast spells with that chosen name. Meddling Mage is a really nice disrupted creature that lets you develop your board while also stopping your opponent's game plan. Naming your opponent's best removal spell can stop them from getting rid of an important threat, or naming one of their threats can stop them from putting up blockers or putting their game plan together. However, the best use of this card is probably against combo decks. Lots of combo decks rely on very specific cards to be able to win, and making it so they can't cast one single important card can completely kill their deck. For example, decks like Storm really need their Storm cards to actually do anything, and Elves decks really rely on Glimpse of Nature to go off. Meddling Mage can really slow these decks down by requiring them to find removal spell before they can start putting their combo together. Meddling Mage's main home has been 4 or 5 color human decks in Modern and Legacy, decks that can use cards like Secluded Courtyard to cast all their spells. These decks have been getting a lot worse over time, as all tribal decks have been. However, the card still sees occasional playing decks that want to add to the board while stopping their opponent's combos. And at number 4, we have Puresteel Paladin. This is a 2/2 human knight with a mana cost of 2 white. It has the abilities where, whenever an equipment enters the battlefield under your control, you draw a card. It also has the ability where, as long as you control 3 or more artifacts, equipments you control have equip 0. Puresteel Paladin really likes equipment, and has 2 nice abilities that make equipment a lot better. However, despite this, it historically hasn't seen much play. Despite things like Stoneforge Mystic seeing tons of play in Legacy, Puresteel has basically never seen success in that format. All that changed when Colossus Hammer was printed. Hammer is an equipment that gives the equipped creature +10/+10 and only costs 1 mana to cast, but it has the downside that it costs a massive equip cost of 8. Of course, if you can equip it to a creature without paying the equip costs, using something like Puresteel Paladin, you get a card that's way too strong for its mana costs. This card getting printed made Puresteel go from a card that rarely saw some play in Modern to a big part of one of the best decks in Modern. Puresteel is great not only because it's an important combo piece, but its ability to draw you cards is also great whenever the deck is simply playing a more fair game plan. Hammer Time decks will usually play as a more straightforward aggro deck if they can't draw into their combo or their opponent draws a way to stop their combo without stopping them entirely. And Puresteel giving them a steady stream of cards both makes their aggro plan better and can let them draw into their combo again. With all that said, Puresteel still isn't seen play in any format outside of Modern, as Modern is the only format where Hammer Time combo is really viable. So while Puresteel is extremely strong in this deck, it's not a particularly strong card on its own, which is why it's only at number 4. And at number 3, we have Collector Ouphe. This is a 2/2 Ouphe with a mana cost of 1 and 1 green, and the ability where the activated abilities of artifacts can't be activated. Ouphe is really good at shutting down very specific decks. There are tons of artifacts with great activated abilities, like Walking Ballista or Steel Overseer, and turning these cards off against these decks can put you really far ahead. However, the best use of this card is against artifacts that produce mana. In older formats like Legacy, lots of decks use cards like Lion's Eye Diamond and Chrome Mox to power out combos incredibly quickly. Or in the case of Vintage, they use the artifact ramp from Power 9 to make their plays, which are even more powerful and even more ubiquitous in the format. And while this isn't the biggest consideration, these kinds of cards and other mana rocks are really powerful and popular in Commander, including CEDH, where these cards see lots of play to stop incredibly powerful cards, like Soul Ring and Mana Crypt. Ouphe is a huge blowout, as not only does it stop these cards from working, but since your opponent still had to draw the card, Ouphe is sort of a phantom 2 or more for 1. Due to just how powerful this effect is in certain metagames, the card has seen a lot of play in these formats, and does a lot to help more fair decks compete with incredibly fast combo decks that use all these artifacts to generate a ludicrous amount of mana. It hasn't really seen much play in Modern, as the best artifact deck in that format is Hammer Time, which can often play around it with cards like Sigarda's Aid. And at number 2, we have Eidolon of the Great Revel. This is a 2/2 spirit enchantment creature with a mana cost of 2 red. It has the ability where, whenever any player, including yourself, casts a spell with a mana value of 3 or less, Eidolon deals 2 damage to that player. First off, we should go over how most spells that players cast in older formats like Pioneer, Modern, Legacy have a mana value of 3 or less. Honestly, most cards in standard decks have a mana value of 3 or less, so Eidolon is going to be triggering a lot. Now, this 2 damage also may not seem that impactful, but if you're dealing enough damage to your opponent, it can be really hard to play around. This is why Eidolon only sees play in aggro decks that specialize in dealing a lot of fast damage to their opponent. Decks like Modern Burn will bring their opponent to around 10 life by the second turn of the game, and at that point, taking 2 damage each time you try to cast anything can make your turns a lot more complicated. Now, the downside of Eidolon dealing damage to you whenever you cast a spell is real, but it's fairly easy to work around. As long as each spell you cast is dealing more damage to your opponent than it is to you, you'll be fine. Most burn spells deal 3 damage, so you'll be lowering your opponent's life total faster than your own. All of this combined has led Eidolon being a staple in red aggro decks in Pioneer and Modern, though these decks aren't quite good enough in formats like Legacy and Vintage. Now, while this card is really strong, it's only good in very specific decks, whereas the number 1 spot on this list has continued to see play in a whole bunch of different decks. Speaking of which, and at number 1, we have Scavenging Ooze. This is a 2/2 Ooze with a mana cost of 1 and 1 green, with the ability where you can pay 1 green to exile a target card from a graveyard. If it was a creature card, you put a +1/+1 counter on Ooze and gain 1 life. Ooze is a card that's good at a lot of things, but not great at any one thing. Sure, it is good at being an efficient threat, but not as good as a card like Tarmogoyf. Sure, it's good at being a piece of graveyard hate, but it's not as good as a card like Rest in Peace and Sanctifier En-vec. And sure, it's good at giving you some extra life to help against aggro, but it's not as good at that as cards like Timely Reinforcements. What makes Ooze so strong and so widely played is doing all of these things at once. This means that it's almost always live in every matchup, and you can pretty comfortably play it in your main board, which means that you can use it during game 1 of a match. Usually, Graveyard Hate and Life Gain cards are stuck in the sideboard to be used only when they're useful, but Ooze can be played in any green mid-range deck and be a good beater. The fact that Ooze is always good has led to it seeing tons of play in a whole bunch of formats at different times. It's seen play in Explorer, Historic, Pioneer, Modern, Legacy, almost every format of Magic, not to mention it's run through Standard. While it isn't the best bear for any one deck, it is the bear that's the best in the most situations and has seen play in the broadest variety of decks, which is why Ooze is taking the number 1 spot on this list. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any cards you think we may have missed, or do you have any ideas for future videos just like this one? If so, go ahead and leave those in a comment down below.